Today we're doing the alteration shorten a man's dress shirt sleeve with raised placket. We start by measuring how much we're shortening the sleeve. This one is 5 1/4 inches. Then we have to take off the cuff and placket. We begin with our seam ripper to start off the first few threads before switching to the razor for speed. You'll notice I'm opening the seam before cutting each section of thread to prevent cutting the fabric on accident. Very carefully taking the cuff off of the end of the sleeve, and when it gets to the end I switch back to the seam ripper to take off the last few threads instead of accidentally cutting the cuff. I lay the cuff itself aside and start with the placket, taking the button off first, making sure to hold the razor towards the bottom of the button so that as I'm cutting the thread, once again, I'm not cutting the fabric. Start again with the razor or with the seam ripper before switching to the razor. Still very careful to only cut the threads and not the fabric of the placket or the fabric of the shirt. There are several seams in a placket, and you want to make sure that you're carefully removing each individual stitch. Now that the smaller side of the placket is removed, I move on to the bigger side of the placket. Sometimes when you hold the fabric remarkably straight, you can just slide the razor down in between the placket and the sleeve to slice through the seam a little easier. This takes practice. Finally, you will need to remove the old threads. I found the most efficient way to do this is with the razor blade. Who knew it could be such a versatile tool? Just lightly scrape the edge of the razor blade over the fabric, and you'll watch how the threads just pull right out of the old seam. Sometimes it takes more than one pass, but it's a lot faster than trying to pick them out by hand. We want to do each section of the cuff and placket this way, so that we make sure that we're not hitting any of those loose threads and causing problems when we try to re-stitch the placket back on. We're making sure to keep the placket and the cuff together so we don't lose any of the little parts that we need. Look how clean those threads are and the pile of thread that we have accumulated next to them. Now we're ready for the next step. The first thing we do after taking off the cuff and placket is to iron our sleeve flat. This is going to make sure that there are no tucks, there are no wonky cuts. We know where we're marking and we know where we're cutting. Then we measure how short we want to make the sleeve. In this case, 5 1/4 inches, and we're going to make a mark at the top of that ruler and connect it so that it's straight all the way across. Then we carefully cut through both layers of the fabric of the shirt sleeve, right below the mark we just made. Now we're going to line up our ruler with the edge of the seam that we took out. We're trying to keep it as straight as possible and make a couple of marks on the fabric. Take the bigger side of the placket and line it up between those marks, making sure that the bottom of it is even with the bottom of the sleeve. See how we move the sleeve to make sure it's all flat, easy to touch. We're going to mark the top of the placket. That's where the peak should line up. Now we're going to put our ruler on top of the placket and mark the sides of the placket so that we know it's nice and straight as the placket should sit on the cuff or on the sleeve of the shirt. Then take the smaller side of the placket and line it up because we need that little seam line. So all the way to the bottom, and then right at that seam line we're going to make a mark. That's the height of where we're cutting. Now we line up the ruler with the peak of the old placket and make a nice mark on our fabric. Cut almost all the way up to the lower placket mark and then out towards the corner of that mark. See the little flap that we just cut through? That was at the top of the smaller placket. We're finally sitting down to the machine to put the placket back on. So we're going to make sure that we know which side of the sleeve to put which side of the cuff on. Line up the small side of the placket first with the inside of the sleeve. Note that we want to go up to the previous seam line, or rather start there. And we're going to stitch in the crease, or just next to it towards the open edge. Line everything up, make sure it's nice and flat and straight. The bottom edges meet. And all of this is before we start sewing. So you're double checking to make sure the seam line is going to be in case that extra cut at the bottom. And then we're going to get started Like a professional, always remember to reverse. Constantly make sure that everything is lined up. It's very important for a nice professional finish. So all the way down to the bottom, reverse for a few stitches. And like every professional, we're going to make sure that we can clip all of our seams, all of our extra threads. Make sure that everything's laying flat. That thread was pulling the seam a little bit. So once we get it nice and clipped, we just flatten everything out. Once we have that first one in, and make sure it's laying correctly, we fold it over. Then from the outside of the shirt sleeve, after clipping that thread we missed last time, we're going to go back over this and put in the seam that we see from the outside of the shirt. Very carefully keeping our seam close to the edge and making sure that we can feel where everything is landing underneath. We're going to make sure that little tab flows up. It adds extra strength to the placket once we're done. And you'll see how we're constantly straightening everything to make sure it's all laying flat. We're not getting any tucks. The more experience we have at this, the more things will just lay flatter for us because we'll know how to do it to begin with. But like everybody trying to learn a new skill, sometimes it doesn't quite turn out the way you want it to. Always double check. You can see where some of it didn't quite line up the way it was supposed to. So we're going to rip that out and put it back in the way it's supposed to be. We can see here that I have ripped out the old seam and I am putting it back in correctly. Never be afraid to correct your mistakes, especially while you're moving forward with your professional career. That is a main reason why we double check our work. And you'll notice here that I'm lining it up so that I can feel both the top and the bottom side of that little placket while I'm putting in the stitches, being a little more careful than I was last time. Once again, remembering to trim my extra threads. Now that the small side of the placket is in, I can start with the larger side of the placket, the buttonhole side. Now, I'm still going to start from the inside of the sleeve. Open up the buttonhole side of the placket so I have just that little flap that was the inside of the seam last time, and line it up. Just like I did for the small side of the placket, I'm going to make that seam right in that ditch, making sure that I've got that inside of that notch in the seam. That way it doesn't stick out and fray on the outside of the shirt. As long as it's caught in the seam, no fraying. You can see there that one thread got caught and is pulling on the seam, so I clip it and it lays nice and flat again the way it's supposed to. These are some of the little things that will always happen when you're sewing, usually at an inopportune moment. Once I have that inside done, I fold the small side of the placket into the bigger side, so that little extra piece right there isn't sticking out. Got to make everything line up because those two are supposed to overlap at the top. This particular shirt had two seam lines at the top of the placket. So we're going to start with the lower one. Make sure everything is lined up. Make sure everything is nice and tucked in so there's no raw edges sticking out. No fraying. And we want that underside of the placket to line up directly underneath the overside. So in order to keep everything straight, we're going to put a pin right there. Make sure it's nice and flattened out. You can see where the two seams were, how it comes up and around and down. You'll notice that we had just a little bit sticking out right there, so we reset it. And for good measure, to keep everything straight, we got another pin. I'm taking the pin out so I don't hit it with a needle, obviously. Going over it more than once, make sure that it's nice and secure in there and I don't have to worry about anything coming out. Now I'm just going to turn Normally I would have turned at the back corner and gone up and around, but like I said, this one had two seams, so we want to keep it as close to original as possible. Turn it around, make sure everything is flat. You'll be able to feel if there's a tuck or something in there, as long as you're careful. stopping right on the other seam line. Don't want to get any of my fabric caught up underneath there. Stitch slowly because you don't want it to run away from you. At every corner, stop and turn your fabric. And you'll notice at the peak, instead of continuing to turn around the same way I turn it back the other way. That's so that everything continues to lay flat and I can move forward without too much bunching in that little area of the sewing machine. And now I'm just sewing down the edge, making sure that I'm staying on top of the old seam and right where the edge of both layers of fabric are. Keeping everything nice and tucked in. Pull it off. We'll check both sides of it. Cut off all our threads. You can see that everything is lined up and everything is sewn in place so far. Cutting just the stray threads and none of the fabric. Test it, line it up. Now we're ready to put the cuff back on. So the first thing we do is check which side is the outside, which side is the buttonhole on, because we want to make sure we line that buttonhole on the cuff up with the buttonhole on the placket. Sometimes there will be a couple little tiny extra threads that we take care of. And we'll know that the sleeve on the shirt is much bigger than the sleeve, or than the cuff is wide, so we're going to have to put in pleats. One of the ways we know how to do this is to make sure that we have the ends matched up nice and tight in there, just like it was originally, and pin it so that it stays in place while we're doing everything else we need to do. Double check. Now the pleats are supposed to be approximately 1 inch from the buttonhole. And they're 1-inch pleats. Give or take depending on the width of your shirt. Sometimes they have to be a little more or a little less. You want to be careful, and if you're not sure, take a look at the other side of the shirt to make sure that you're getting enough fabric out that it's going to all line up and not have any tucks. You can put another pleat in on the button side of the cuff if you need to. But you'll notice if I put one in here how close it is to the edge, so I definitely wouldn't want 2 in next to that seam. However, a little one to take out the extra fabric isn't going to hurt. Now we go back to the original side and make sure we've got those pleats in correctly. If you're not sure what an inch looks like, measure it. If you think you've got it, go ahead and try it. First you want to pin it, and then you're going to hold the cuff and the sleeve end to end to make sure that they line up. Sometimes it's easier to have the needle through one end of the cuff before you start holding it up so that it's easier to see around that curve. Since these line up, we're going to go ahead and put our seam in, holding the cuff the same way we held the plackets to make sure that we're sewing through where the seam was on both sides of the cuff. Obviously, remove your pins. Hitting a pin is no fun. As we go around the cuff, we're making sure that just enough of the sleeve is tucked inside of the cuff that everything stays straight the way it's supposed to be. See, double check everything. You don't want it to go on crooked. And voila! Your cuff and placket have been raised. However, you're not quite finished yet. Remember to finish taking out all of your pins, double check all of your seams, and then the last thing you're going to need to do is line that button back up and put it on. So hold the larger side of the placket over the smaller side, making sure that everything is flat and straight. Grab your chalk, mark through the buttonhole. Now you know you don't want that off the edge, so you're going to move the mark over to the center of that smaller side of the placket. And then follow the directions in Put the Button Back to sew the button onto the cuff or onto the placket.